Hi geography students, it's Mrs. T and this is week 14. We are rounding out our semester with some review information but also some new information to overlap on top of that so we can build with our foundational knowledge and critical thinking in cultural geography class. So week 13 took us from the development chapter, which is chapter 10 or 11, can't remember, in our textbook, and now we're in the agriculture chapter where we're going to talk about agriculture again. That's the part of the review that we're going to have today, because we've talked about agriculture a couple of different times in over the course of the semester, and now we're going to talk about it in more of a globalized sense, not global in the way that we talked about development in week 13, but how it changed the world, how it changed human history and human geography over time. We're going to talk about revolutions in human history and human geography. The word revolution means drastic change, right? So revolution we use for wars, we use for any type of drastic change when we're describing that in a culture, in a society. And so there have been 3 agricultural revolutions in human history, meaning 3 points that we can look at in history to say, at this point, we see evidence in the archaeology record, we see evidence in the historic record that lifestyles changed, population densities changed, stages in demographic transition changed or progressed. So there have been 3 agricultural revolutions, and so far we have 2 industrial revolutions. One is called the Industrial Revolution, another one is really post-industrial, where the economy changed to a service-oriented, non-manufacturing base for some of the stage 4 countries in demographic transition. And the post-industrial world that we live in today is one of the reasons why some geographers argue that we are in stage 5 in the demographic transition model that we learned about way back in February, I think it was, when we were together back in February. Remember, there's a lot of debate among geographers about the 5 stages of the demographic transition model. Really, between stage 2 and 3, we see that first agricultural revolution happen, and then 3 and 4, we see this second agricultural revolution. Let me go ahead and number these for you so that you can tell which ones I'm talking about when I say there's 3 agricultural revolutions. So anyway, in the 2000s, we see an additional agricultural revolution that's overlapped with the advances, the scientific advances that industrialism made possible. So you see huge changes to the food supply really starting in 1990s through the 2000s, where we're living in today. So let's talk about agriculture. So of course, a general definition of agriculture is production of crops and animals in order to have a food supply. However, agriculture is a surplus-oriented endeavor. In chapter 11, I believe it is, on agriculture, you will read about something called subsistence farming. So subsistence is a word we've talked about before. It means to survive from day to day. So when we talk about subsistence agriculture, that's what really happened approximately 14,000 years ago, according to the textbook information. Some recent articles I've read in Archaeology Magazine puts this number at 13,000 years ago, but there's archaeological evidence that indicates that approximately 14,000 years ago, we can see that human societies began producing crops in an agricultural way rather than merely in a subsistence agricultural way, rather than merely living from foraging or hunting and gathering, which includes fishing, or through pastoralism, which uses herd animals to interact with harsh environmental conditions that otherwise would not allow human beings to survive, or horticultural societies, which were very much more communal than you and I maybe have have a context for in our mind. Horticultural communities used farming techniques, agricultural techniques to feed their immediate social group in their village setting. And it was not a surplus oriented type of production method. And so all of those things, foraging, pastoralism, and subsistence horticulture, are very small scale, either food production methods or food gathering methods that had varying degrees of interaction with the environment. Remember, one of our issues in Mr. Help is human-environment interaction. And so foraging has human-environment interaction, but it's with very little modification to the environment, the least amount of modification to the environment that you can get away with in foraging. So you don't artificially manipulate the yield that's going to happen in a foraging culture. You don't plant extra of a plant. You don't save seeds from one growing season to the next to manipulate the natural populations of plants and animals in foraging. And so that keeps populations very, very low. With pastoralism and with horticulture, you are also not modifying the environment very much. You are working with the environmental conditions you have in order to maintain a population size that those environmental conditions support. So, for instance, with horticulture, something called, let me just use this space on the board really quick to write this word, something called Swidden horticulture. This is something that your book refers to as slash and burn cultivation. Slash and burn sounds very, very, it sounds like a lot of human environment interaction. It is, where you cut things down in a field, you remove stumps, you remove everything that you're going to need in order to be able to produce crops. You burn what's there because burning really puts a lot of good nutrients into the soil, and you use that particular plot of land that you slashed and burned. It's called Swidden cultivation. For the fertilizer value of what you have burned there, and you use it for a few seasons, and then after you use it for a few seasons, you let it lie what's called fallow in order to not use it for a good 20-30 years in some cases when you move to a different plot that you have slashed and burned. And it's a natural kind of process. Let me explain what I mean natural here. Obviously, cutting things down, digging up roots, burning what's left, this is very, very human interactive with the environment there. But the natural process is that fire is a natural process that causes natural chemicals and ash to be produced. So when I say natural, I'm talking about the resulting fertilizer that is used. And so slash and burn cultivation sounds very violent and destructive, and you have a good argument that it is violent and destructive. However, usually it's not over a huge area of land, because this kind of cultivation is not surplus oriented for the most part. Remember, that was a huge, huge difference with agriculture. Agriculture creates that surplus that we were talking about that results in such drastic differences between owners and slaves and everybody in between in that hierarchy of social order where surplus is involved. So these types of subsistence strategies, foraging, pastoralism, or horticulture, whether it's Swidden horticulture or some other type, these do not support huge human populations because surplus is not the focus. It's just to provide enough subsistence for just a subsistence level food, water, and shelter needs for your particular population. And you don't try to expand past that. So when agriculture came on the scene, what I mean by that is when human beings figured out how to control larger plots of land, how to use seeds and use growing seasons to produce surpluses, you see huge jumps in the population, with villages and hamlets turning into cities, turning into economic centers, turning into those urban structures that we looked at back in the urban geography chapter. So there were three agricultural revolutions, one about 14,000 years ago when the population really boomed, and that made way for larger cities, more diversified populations, more division of labor within the populations. Not everybody was concentrated solely on agricultural work. You saw more jobs, different types of jobs be available in a society. And then in the 1750s through 1800s is just the rough timeline, very rough span that we're going to talk about for the Industrial Revolution. Another agricultural revolution occurred at roughly these same dates for the Industrial Revolution. So 1750 through about 1850, really, you'll see those dates in a lot of history books. So this second agricultural revolution coincides with the Industrial Revolution that we have studied so often in history class and referred to so often in geography class also. So a second agricultural revolution occurred because the machines, the tools that were being mass produced in the factory system enabled agriculture to just skyrocket, enabled agricultural production to simply skyrocket. So the surplus went through the roof, went past the roof. And all of a sudden, you had massive production of food and supply of food being available. And so this was yet another huge bump in population that created those much more diverse cityscapes that we learned about in the urban geography chapter, and also resulted in a lot of the segmentation of the globe that we now have learned about in the development chapter when we talk about periphery nations versus semi-periphery nations versus core nations. Those periphery nations that we learned about really focus less on the surplus. Well, let me correct myself. The population of those nations that support themselves through agriculture are usually doing so through a subsistence agriculture focus. Whereas corporations, we watched that documentary about a mining corporation, but there are also corporations that focus on agricultural pursuits. So in those periphery nations, the surplus agricultural pursuits are usually controlled by those large international conglomerates, those corporations, similar to the one that we witnessed in week 13 when we watched that documentary. And so you still see a lot of the different flavors of these agricultural revolutions spread out across the world today. Just because 13 to 14,000 years ago was the first archaeological evidence that agriculture and animal husbandry was part of the human experience does not mean that that style of agriculture is not still practiced in many places in the world. The agriculture boom that happened during the Industrial Revolution, we have seen leaps and bound changes in that. We're not just talking about that plow that you can that you can get a horse or an ox to take through your field for you, which really boosted production. Now you're talking about huge equipment that's run on diesel and motorized, all this kind of stuff that does 14 rows at a time, 24 rows at a time. Artificial fertilizers, not the slash and burn kind, but artificial chemical fertilizers, really heavily manipulated water systems in order to have enough irrigation to produce these huge amounts of surpluses that corporations and large-scale farming relies upon. So it really, really changed the human landscape. It really changed human environment interaction and commodified land. So commodity is something that is valuable to people. A commodity is something that can produce income or profit for you. And so land Arable land, let's use this word really quick right here. Again, I'll use this space on the board here. Arable land, which means you can produce agricultural items on it. It's plantable. Plants will grow on that land. You can cultivate that. Arable land means you can cultivate it. Arable land became very, very attractive to farmers, definitely large-scale farmers. You see a lot of environmental hazards that are produced by large-scale farmers because you're talking about artificial chemical fertilizers, artificial chemical pesticides and herbicides, meaning it kills bugs and other things that might want to eat the plants, and the herbicides, of course, kill weeds and things that can choke out your money-making plant. And you see a lot of deposits of unnatural chemicals into the land, into the water system. You see a change of ecosystems. You see a lot of evidence that lots of species in nature, species in the wilderness, are affected adversely by some of these artificial means of making land arable, making land cultivatable, which is what arable means. So you see a lot of environmental impact that has occurred because of the second agricultural revolution, which of course extended on into the 1900s, and then of course the third agricultural revolution. Let me not jump ahead and talk about that just yet. Let me talk about a couple of other key terms from your development chapter and also the agricultural chapter. One way that large-scale farmers make land arable is they clear it. So I just talked about swidden cultivation, where people clear a certain area of land and use it for a short period of time while that ash still makes the soil very rich. And then they let that section lie fallow and move to another area, slash it and burn it, and use that for a few years for their community to survive on, and then let that lie fallow and move to another one. And if you have 20 or 30 plots that are plenty to keep your community going from one year to the next, then by the time you get to your 30th plot over here to slash and burn, your first one that you started with way over here 30 years ago has huge trees on it and lots of wildlife and all kinds of dead decaying stuff and animal poop and leaves and things for, of all of the deciduous trees, and it's just made such wonderful rich topsoil in that 30 years. And you go back to it and you slash it and you burn it, and then the ash makes it even more rich and wonderful for you to be able to use that as cultivatable or arable land. But if you're really, really focused on surplus, you can't do that. You can't leave 29 very wonderful plots of land to nature. You can't let those lie fallow in order to wait for nature to produce the fertilizer. You have to clear it all, and clear it all now, and find some kind of artificial mechanism in order to make it arable. And so there is a key term in chapter 10, I believe, or chapter 11, deforestation. You can see the word forest in here. Deforestation means we're going to go in and we're not going to let anything lie fallow and have trees grow back up and rebuild a forest. We're going to remove the forest, and remove the forest permanently, because the land is attractive, the land is arable, perhaps the land is easy to cultivate, perhaps the land is in an area that's easy to irrigate it, or it's close to a water source, or you can maybe build canals to get water to it very, very easily, and you're going to keep that land in permanent cultivation, which means you will need artificial chemical fertilizers in order to be able to have the kinds of nutrients in it that plants need to produce you a predictable and sustainable surplus over time. So deforestation is a significant way humans have an impact on our environment that really changes climate, and it changes the environment over time. For instance, it's not a forest that I'm going to give you an example of, but you could look this up. It's a very good It's a very good example of something similar to deforestation. Here in the United States, look up the era in history called the Dust Bowl. So the Dust Bowl coincides with the Great Depression, so that era in history. And what essentially happened in the 50 years prior to the Dust Bowl era, you didn't have forests being removed, but you had grasslands being removed across the Central Plains in the United States. And these grasslands had a certain microclimate over them that produced rain regularly to keep the grasses alive. But when farmers moved in there, subsistence farmers who were primarily interested in just a little bit of surplus to make a little extra money on the side, when they moved in and cleared all of the grasslands, plowed it under and kept it dirt-like, the climate changed and there wasn't as much rainfall, there wasn't as much irrigation to make those fields arable for the kinds of crops the farmers wanted to put there. Nature wanted grasses there. Nature provided the kind of rainfall that those grasses needed, which was very little, actually. Grass doesn't need very much rainfall in order to thrive and continue from one generation, one season to the next. But when farmers moved in and tilled it all under, the little bit of rainfall that was available was not nearly enough, and came less often because of the different kind of radiant energy that the sun, put on that barren land. And so even though there was not a forest that was cleared, you can look at the destruction of the grasslands in the Central Plains in the United States as an example of how deforestation can change microclimates, can change climates on a larger scale also across the world, not just change the cultural landscape and the way that we look at things, but it really is a major social problem, a global problem these days because of the development issues that we saw in our interactions together last week. Deforestation creates a global issue of environmental impact and harm. So research deforestation, read about it in your textbook, and you don't have to search for the Dust Bowl if you would like to look, for instance, deforestation in the Amazon or any of the other examples that your textbook provides to you. Another issue that comes from the mass manipulation of land in order to provide, in order to try to create arable land from land, the way nature had it, is desertification. Okay, so I've got a lot of ications on here. So deforestation and desertification, this is creating deserts, right? The process of turning land into deserts. So a desert doesn't necessarily mean it's hot. A desert means that it is dry. A desert means it's dry. So, desertification occurs sometimes as a result of deforestation, or something like happened with the Dust Bowl, where you didn't have enough water resources in order to maintain farming where people wanted to maintain farming. So desert simply means dry. It doesn't necessarily always mean hot. You can have a desert way up around the Arctic Circle, and you do, and it's based on very little humidity, very little rainfall and precipitation over the course of the year. And so because agricultural surplus, the second agricultural revolution, and certainly up through the 1900s with the kinds of mass corporate agricultural production that occurred, you see a lot of water resources that in nature were over here being rerouted to where the large-scale farming industry wants it to be. Right down the street from my house, where I live in central Arkansas, there is a canal system that has been in progress for about the last 15 years, where rice farmers from Stuttgart, Arkansas, which is known as the rice capital of the world. Stuttgart is an area of Arkansas that is over an aquifer, so look up what aquifer means as far as physical geography goes. Aquifers should enable people people to have almost an unlimited supply of water over time, but the mass production of rice in Stuttgart that requires huge amounts of water has depleted the aquifer to where I might be wrong that it's entirely empty, but it's almost empty, and there's not enough for those farmers to continue with the same production anymore that they've had in the past. So I live very close to the Arkansas River. There's a canal being built from the Arkansas River to the aquifers in Stuttgart to provide those farmers with enough water to maintain their massive surplus rice production. So sometimes desertification can occur because you're taking water from one place that used to make it lush, green, abundant, and you're rerouting it to another place where you want to make the land arable. So one place could have been very lush and plentiful, whereas another place was dry, and just rerouting through a canal system, through any sort of artificial irrigation means, you can create arable lands from deserts or create desert areas where there used to not be desert areas. And this is from the human-environment interaction that occurs with this focus, that surplus focus on agriculture. Now, I think you and I are, I'm kind of talking down a little bit about agriculture here. I love going to the grocery store and having my industrialized agricultural choices in front of me. I pick up grapes and it says that they were produced in Chile, which is a country in South America. I pick up avocados, or we can watch ads on TV or little snippets on Facebook that says avocados from Mexico, right? I mean, we eat those daily, and this is because of our industrialized agricultural production that brings Stuttgart rice to Tokyo, Japan for their rice bowls or whatever they use it for. Use rice all the time in Japan and Asia, all over the place. And there's a lot of export from Stuttgart to areas in Asia that are known for rice consumption. So we benefit in our culture from these efforts. However, we also hurt ourselves because of these efforts, because a lot of time the focus is on surplus rather than on preservation of the environment or preservation of a way of life that is sustainable for the future. It doesn't have to be preservation that you're focused on, but sustainability that you're focused on. And a lot of times when profit and surplus is the goal, sustainability costs money. So I'm a little less interested in hearing anything about sustainability because it's going to cost me money, bring down my profit. And why am I producing surplus? For profit. And so agriculture is a wonderful thing, and it's a terrible thing, depending upon which point you're looking at. I feel like I'm, writing a book, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Well, there are two sides to every coin, and there is a delicate balance, I guess you could say, and probably we're a little out of balance if you ask most climate researchers, and certainly when you see documentaries like we watched in week 13, there's a lot of questionable practices about depleting the world of its resources and mistreating each other because of surplus, because of profit in those cases. So this is the first part of our discussion of agriculture, and I will see you again for one or two more short videos to finish out this chapter for week 14. Please contact me with questions, and I look forward to hearing from you. Bye.